Hi, my name is Dale Mazzarella. I'm a Fly Fishers International Master Casting Instructor, a longtime Wyoming fishing guide, and an award-winning coach and educator. I've put together this video series that I hope will help you become a better fisherman, catch a lot more fish, and I hope you enjoy it. So enjoy yourself, have a good time, and let me know what you think. We're going to discuss nymph rigs, and we're not going to be dealing with Euro systems, just nymph rigs with an indicator for right now. We're also not going to be worrying about how exactly to fish these. We're going to talk a little bit about it, but most of that's going to be in a subsequent video. Right now, the things to consider when we're dealing with a nymph is we need to worry about the depth of the water, we need to worry about the speed of the water, we need to know about the location of the fish. We need to consider what's the food source they're most likely eating at that moment, and the type of bottom structure. All of those things are going to create a different sort of nymph system, or a different kind of nymph rigging system. So the basic bottom line is this: you got to get your fly to the fish. If you can't get your fly to the fish, you're not going to catch any fish. You have to have the right fly, or at least a fly that's likely to be eaten. You have to have some kind of a movement that mimics the movement of the food source in the water. If it's drifting dead, then you need to have a dead drift. If it's swimming, you need to swim it. If it's jerking or pulsating, you need to pulsate it. So those are the kinds of things we all need to consider when we're having a nymphing situation. A lot of people make the same mistake that a lot of people make when they're doing streamer rigs, and that is they set up the same basic system every single time, the same basic rigging, and they just use it, and they assume that's going to make some kind of a successful outcome. And the bottom line is that there are dozens of different variations and considerations when we are developing nymph systems, and rigging systems. So we're going to talk about some of those as we go along. First, let's talk about the equipment a little bit. I like a long rod with a soft tip, a pretty flexible rod. We're talking about long, 10 to 11 feet long, so I can control my drift by either high sticking or by mending effectively. So one of the things I first consider when I'm deciding what to do with a nymph rig is what kinds of flies am I going to use. And in my boxes I carry a couple of different categories of flies. The first one, I carry a lot of beaded flies, gold beads, silver beads, big gaudy kinds of flies. Those are basically, they may or may not match a hatch pretty well, but they're basically going to be an attractor fly. I may fish them with weight, no weight, or whatever. The other thing I have is a lot of common flies. These are flies that are used commonly. They're leeches and stone flies in freestone streams, caddis larvae, stuff that's in everybody's stream. And I have a lot of those in my fly boxes too, so I don't have to worry about matching the hatch sometime, because there's always some of that stuff in a river. And the last thing I do is I do a lot of soft tackle flies for different purposes, and we'll explain that in just a minute. But soft tackle flies mimic emergers, they mimic dead flies that fell into the water, that sort of thing. Presentation, almost always I present flies downstream when I'm nymphing. The only exception would be when if there's a caddis hatch and there's emerging caddis, I will fish upstream. And that'll be pretty apparent in some of the videos, the subsequent videos that we do. But I can control drag and drift and mends and all that stuff a lot better from upstream than I can downstream. So that's something I always do. So we're looking for a drag-free drift 90% of the time. Pretty much we can mimic with an indicator the kinds of results we get with a really good Euro type, the Spanish, Italian, French, those kinds of systems, Czech systems. So that's what our goal is, even with an indicator. My favorite setup for nymphs is a two-fly system. And normally I'm going to sort of demonstrate this with this system here. You can tie your top fly. I call this the top fly and this the bottom fly, because when you look at it dangling off the tip of your rod, that's the top fly and this the bottom fly. You could put three flies. You can add a fly to this one if you want to. And if you want to, you can do this. This is just tag ends off of either blood knots or surgeon knots, and you can tie your flies on it. So there are some advantages to this. We'll talk about it in a minute. But in any case, I generally like my top fly to be my biggest, heaviest fly, and I've just tied these big old things on just because they represent about the right size proportion, and you can see them in this video. But normally I just tie this bottom fly off the hook bend of the top fly, and I use the top fly as my heaviest fly. And I'll explain why. This is going to be my fly, this particular case, this got a couple of dumbbell eyes on it, and this one is much lighter. So when I put this in a river, and assuming this is tied to the bend of the hook, or even if it's not, this fly is going to be down. This fly, my second fly, or my bottom fly, is my lightest fly. It's often trying to match the hatch. It's the one I'm most likely to catch a fish on. This fly is only about 8 inches to 10 inches below this fly. I don't like a whole lot of space because, again, what we need to do, we need to eliminate slack between this fly here and our indicator. If we can eliminate slack, any slight little take right here is going to result in that indicator moving and giving us a signal to set the hook. So this fly is used as an attractor and as a weight. That's primarily the reason for this fly. It's not to say that they won't take this fly occasionally, but I like the heaviest fly up here. A lot of people, I've seen people put the heavy fly down here. I don't like that at all unless you're on some kind of a tag end here. But if you're tying a heavy fly to the bend of the hook of the fly above it in the system, then what's going to happen? Your fly is it can't drift anywhere. It's being trapped by this heavy fly. I don't like that. I like this fly. This fly is always, my bottom fly is virtually always, this fly is going to be light with no weight, and it's going to be drifting around in a current with very little slack between it and the other fly because there's not much space. So this fly gets down, this fly is floating around, and we're floating around the river like this. That's my favorite system right here. The other thing we try to do is we think about the different kinds of hatches that we're having. In a pre-hatch situation, let's say it's June, towards the end of June on the river I fish, we've got pretty much a PMD hatch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a heavy pheasant tail nymph with a gold bead on right here, because I know that fly, it mimics pretty closely. If I put a size 16 gold beaded pheasant tail, it's pretty close to what's down there right now getting ready to hatch. And then at the back, I might put another fly, which is more exact representation of a PMD. So it might be a split back PMB, something like that. This is going to be a much more representative fly of the hatch. So now this is going to get their attention. And then when they see the big fly, they see the gold bead, they see the fly, it looks pretty good. They come over to inspect it and they're going to eat this. That's the theory anyway. So pre-hatch, I use 2 flies close to the bottom for most pre-hatches because that's where most of the nymphs are, but they're getting kind of active at that point. And then during the hatch, what I might do, I might take all these flies off, or I might end up with this fly on top now. So I put this fly on top, and below it, I would put an emerger. So maybe I'm going to put my top fly now would be an emerger with an early stage emerger that's fairly heavy, and it's going to be floating in the river like this. And my top fly is going to be a late stage emerger. It's got its wing pads fully developed. It might even have some of the wing out, and it's going to be floating along like this. In this case, I'm going to put my indicator pretty close to my flies. So my indicator may only be a foot, 2 feet, depending on the depth of the water and where the fish are and how much feeding there is. My indicator, I can slide it up and down, and you need to look at the indicator video to see about the indicator. By the way, when I'm fishing the bottom, I have a whole different opinion about indicator fishing than most people do. And I believe this. I believe that indicator should be the depth of the water from my heaviest part of the rig system. So if this is it, I don't have a piece of lead. Let's say I have a piece of lead here. If I have a piece of lead here and a weighted fly here, and my indicator's up here, and this water is 3 feet deep, I want it 3 feet deep. I want this 3 feet from here to here. That's what I want. I don't want it 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the water, because if you have it 1.5 to 2.5 to 2 times the depth of the water, you're getting if you cast this thing upstream, let's say that's upstream and this is downstream. If I cast and I have an indicator here and I have flies here, and I don't care how much weight I have, the current is faster at the top than it is at the bottom. So what happens is this is pulling my flies. And so these flies are dragging. Not only that, as they drag across the water. The water actually lifts them up, which is why you need so much lead when you're fishing upstream. You need a ton of weight when you're fishing upstream, and you need 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the current, if it's fast, to get your fly down. If you were to fish downstream instead, with an indicator that's only the depth of the water above your flies, you fish downstream and your flies hit first, your flies are going to sink all the way to the bottom before there's any pull by the indicator. The indicator will eventually catch up, and then I'm going to make continuous mends to I'm going to visualize how fast my fly is going on the bottom, and I'm going to make continual mends to try to create a situation where my fly is directly below my indicator. I don't want it out here. If it's out here and a fish comes and gets it, and he comes back to his lie, you'll never feel it. If it's out here and a fish grabs it from the side and moves it, but if it's right here, I don't care where that fish grabs it, from what direction or how subtle the take is, it's going to move my indicator. So I like my flies like this, and I like to fish downstream, which we're going to talk about a lot during the course of 2018. So what about when we have the hatch is done? We've caught some fish on stage 1 with flies deep, stage 2 with emergers, stage 3, what happens? In stage 3, if there's nothing on the surface, the fish have been pretty satisfied with this big, nice hatch. Then what I'll do is I'll use the same exact system as I did the first time with the pre-hatch. I'll put a big fly on the bottom or a heavy fly on the bottom or both. And then my last fly, this little fly here at the back end, is normally going to be a soft hackle that mimics a drowned adult. Because during a hatch, a lot of fish, a lot of flies end up in the current and they get swept downstream and they sink. So this is going to be a sunk fly. Now that doesn't mean it's always the case, but that's a good option. If you've got a PMD hatch and after the hatch is done, you put on a soft hackle that's got some grayish hackle on it and a light colored yellowish cream body, you're going to catch some fish down there because they're seeing those flies and they're used to seeing those flies, but they're no longer looking at the surface. They're down on the bottom, the fish are. So that's a good system to use. So those are the kinds of things that I think about when I'm trying to fish, and we're going to, of course, do a lot more about this later. But make sure that you're trying to, we need to make sure that we're trying to look at the hatch differently. And by the way, this, depending on the hatch, we're looking at a rigging system differently. This top fly, man, it could be a lot of things. I use a leech up here, I use a worm up here, I use a caddis larva up here, I use a pheasant tail, big pheasant tail. There's a lot of things. You can use a crane fly larva up here, anything that's weighted and it's likely to be in the river on a regular basis. Heck, I've even used up here, I've used crawfish patterns up here with weight on them just to get it down, and this other fly is floating around. Because there's a lot of places where where that is part of the environment of the stream. So think about what you're doing in terms of these rigging systems and adjust the rigging system, adjust the length of the leader, adjust the length of the depth between the indicator and your bottom fly, and what kinds of flies you have depending on the situation. Another rigging that I use, and not very often because I don't like it for some of the reasons we've already discussed, is let's say I've got a lot of sticks on the bottom and my flies keep getting hooked on the bottom, or a lot of moss or something. What you can do is you can put your fly here and you can tie it obviously off the eye or off the butt or off some kind of a little tag end, and you put your lead down here. Tie a knot in the bottom of your leader at the bottom or your tippet at the bottom, just tie a little overhand knot, put a piece of lead right here. Now what happens is that goes along the bottom, this flies up above, and when this gets snagged, you can break it off pretty easy. Put it on fairly light tippet and you can break it off and you won't keep losing your flies. That's good, except for I don't like that. Assuming this tail is the line up to the indicator and you've got weight down here. Look how tight that is. Now, if you put this on a tag end, that's a lot better. But if you just tie it directly to and put it right in line between this this piece of lead and that indicator, boy, that thing can't drift at all. It's stuck. It's going to be doing just like this. The other reason I don't like putting my weighted fly down here, my lighter fly here, is if this is tight, let's say this is taut between weight down here, a fly in the middle, and the indicator or another fly or whatever. When a fish goes to eat that, his mouth hits the fly line, and then that actually pushes the fly away from the fish's mouth. We don't want to have a situation where our fly is suspended on a tight line. So one of the things to think about when we're developing rigging systems is to prevent that from happening. So in that case, we really need to put our flies off on some kind of a tag end. Let's talk about a single fly under an indicator. If this is my fly, and I usually have a knot 7 to 8 inches above the fly where I could put a piece of lead if I want to, because generally if I'm using a single fly, I don't have any weight on that fly. I want that indicator or that lead here, so my lead is down and this fly is kind of being able to float around pretty well with the current. Up here is my indicator, let's say. And then I've got my fly line. One of the things we want to do oftentimes is from the indicator to the fly, let's say I end up with 0x to the indicator. I may put 4x down below it because then you get a hinging effect. And when you get a hinging effect, it sinks the fly faster. And I may well put fluorocarbon on the bottom from the indicator down, maybe fluorocarbon, because it sinks. The smaller diameter, whether it's mono or fluorocarbon, is going to sink faster. The advantage of this system, obviously, is it's simple. And the nice thing about it is, man, it's hard to tangle, it's easier to cast. The disadvantage obviously is that there's only one fly there and you're hoping those fish will eat that one fly. It doesn't give them a lot of choices. When you're using the system with 2 flies or even 3 flies, you got a lot of chances. And especially if you adjust the flies to the level of the current. If you put your bottom fly, one fly at the bottom, one fly a little bit farther up and one farther up a little higher on tag ends, you've got 3 levels of the current that you're fishing, and you've got 3 different types of flies that you're fishing. So you got a much better chance maybe of hooking a fish than a single system, but a single system does have its place. And again, same thing, if I was going to fish the beginning of a PMD hatch, I would put a pheasant tail on here or a split back, something that's pretty likely to be on the bottom of the river just before I know at 2 o'clock there's going to be a PMD hatch. If I want to fish a nymph because the fish are really picky and are taking some kind of an emerger that I'm having trouble with, I might put my indicator much closer, take off the lead, and fish this same split back maybe 6, 8, 10 inches below the surface. And I would just keep adjusting the way I work depending on what stage the hatch is in and what's hatching. So let's talk about knots. We're going to do a little knot section later in this series, but basically I use blood knots to tie pieces of leader together and tippets to leaders. I use a surgeon's knot or a blood knot depending on the situation. It doesn't really make that much difference for tags to put on extra leaders or extra flies, whether they be streamers or nymphs. And then I use, if it's a big fly like a streamer, I'll use a non-slip loop knot. If it's a nymph, I pretty much just use an improved clinch knot. I mean, there's a lot of different knots you can use, but I mean, I found they really don't make that much difference. It's personal preference. If you use a knot, whatever knot you use, it's good, that you're fast at, that you can do when you're cold, when you're tired, when it's getting dark, that's the knot you got to use. And I think I probably use 7 knots total. I don't have a lot of knots in my repertoire because I just haven't needed them. And that includes, catching fish from all over the place, but we'll talk about that more likely. So I think that's pretty much all we're going to talk about in terms of nymphing. The rest of it has to do with presentation of the nymph. How do you get a nymph to sink quickly and then drag free underneath your indicator? How do you get a nymph to be right above? You see a rising fish, if the fish is rising 9 times out of 10, he's eating a lot of down below too. So if you want to get a nymph to that fish, how do you get that nymph lined up so he's in exactly the right lane? That kind of thing we're going to be talking about during the summer of 2018. A lot of little details about how to fish these indicator nymph rigs.